So at this point, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Ted Robles. Ted is a professor of psychology at UCLA, where he studies how stress and social relationships influence health. He is actively involved in research that's focused on both allostatic biological processes, which help aid individuals as they achieve physiological stability during stressful events, as well as in restorative biological processes, which aid individuals in recovering after those stressful events. He studies these biological processes in the context of stress, social support, and close, intimate relationships across the life course, using both experimental and non-experimental designs. And these reflect his interest in different methods to assess psychological constructs and physiology in minimally invasive ways, but that are also clinically relevant. He earned his PhD at Ohio State University, and without further ado, I will hand over the microphone to him to speak about restorative biological processes. Is it still a useful concept for studying health and emotional well-being? Thank you so much, Dr. Robles.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. And then I will share my screen as well. All right. Well, it's wonderful to be with all of you, especially wonderful to be alongside, such great panelists that you'll hear from today that I have known over the years and respected, and I always love to hear them talk. What I'm going to be doing today is introducing you to an important set of biological processes and how we've conceptualized that. As Liz talked about, these are restorative biological processes, and a lot of what I'm going to talk about comes from a paper that actually Jude Carroll and I wrote together about 12 years ago, and actually some of this talk actually comes from a talk I gave at NIA, or at an NIA-sponsored workshop in Miami about 10 years ago. And at the time, that talk was entitled "Restorative Biological Processes and Health: A Useful Concept?" ? After thinking about that talk and how much time has passed, I thought now would be a good time to think about whether it's still useful. And what I've done is kind of updated some of the ideas and some of the data as well. And my goal really today is to kind of focus on broad conceptual framing of some of these biological processes. I'm not going to be able to get into specific ones given the time. I'll talk about a few kind of specific biological processes, but I'm not going to get into a lot of detail. And then hopefully give you a sense of how thinking about these restorative biological processes might be helpful in expanding our understanding of health and emotional well-being. You're probably going to hear some kind of common through lines today, one of which is things like allostatic load and allostasis that Steve brought up in his talk. Many of you might be familiar with the concept of allostatic load. This is a figure from the classic New England Journal of Medicine article written by our late colleague, Bruce McEwen. And the idea is that repeated exposures to stress and challenge lead to cumulative wear and tear on multiple physiological systems over time. And that concept, as Steve also talked about in his talk, derived from this concept of allostasis, which was developed by neuroscientist Peter Sterling, as well as his colleague Joseph Iyer in the late 80s. And the idea behind allostasis is that those are physiological changes that the organism mounts in order to achieve stability, which I always read as survival. So to maintain survival, an organism must vary all the parameters of its internal milieu, match them appropriately to environmental demands. A lot of these changes are involved in increasing energy availability so that we can use our muscles and our brain to cope with stressors. And so that is what is the allostatic concept, or allostasis concept. But interestingly, earlier in the chapter, they describe that there are other processes that use energy, but they don't actually contribute to energy or metabolic mobilization. And so this is a quote from a few pages before the allostasis definition. And so I'll highlight a couple of things. These are processes that use energy. They don't contribute to metabolic mobilization. They're suppressed. Now, just ignore the next part about the immune response, because that's sort of based on some outmoded ideas about what the immune response does during stress. It's not the case, and I think all of us know this, that the immune response is actually highly active during even psychological stressors. So just kind of ignore that last part about cilia. The key part I want you to focus on, though, is the next sentence: wound healing, bone growth and repair, replacement of cellular lining. All of those things slow markedly. And then he also distinguishes between sort of two processes One is spending energy, so breaking down large molecules in order to release energy that we can use to cope with environmental challenges. That's catabolism, catabolic processes. And then there are processes that are involved in rebuilding energy stores and repair and growth, so anabolic processes. And I'm going to come back to these concepts of anabolism and catabolism later. But the idea that there are some processes that are involved in kind of building and growth, rebuilding energy stores and repair and growth, those are the restorative processes that I'll be touching on. And then you actually see some of this come back later in work by many of your colleagues. Alyssa Eppel wrote about the role of anabolic and catabolic processes kind of in the late 1990s and into the early 2000s. I show this just to show you that this idea that there are important building and restorative processes, it's not, I didn't come up with that. And it was really kind of neat to see that, to see the genesis of some of this in the allostatic load work, or the allostasis definitions. So the way we talk about restorative processes is that they are biological processes that are involved in repairing wear and tear and contribute to growth. I put this dictionary definition here just to kind of orient you to what kinds of things might be happening. And so I always think of these two as, the allostatic processes are where you change your biological set points. That is, you're increasing, say, your body temperature, or you're increasing sympathetic activity in order to adapt to environmental challenge. And then restorative processes is returning the organism to a sort of pre-environmental challenge state. They have a number of things in common. So both sets of processes are sort of they are biologically plausible ways that psychological and social factors might connect with health outcomes. Both involve connections from the brain through the pathways that Steve described in his talk to multiple areas of the periphery in the body. And then there are effects on multiple levels. So at the level of cells, at the level of tissues, and then the entire organism. And the main difference then is the timing. So restorative processes, as I wrote here, would be kind of trying to get the organism back to states that were before environmental challenges, whereas allostatic processes are kind of during those challenges. And after about a decade, I would probably amend that a little bit, where to say like when there's relatively less environmental challenge, and you'll see what I mean in just a second. I think it's helpful to kind of just sort of show you a conceptual diagram. So on the x-axis is time, on the y-axis would be kind of response magnitude, and then I'm going to show you sort of discrete epochs of things that are happening in somebody's life. So let's say there's this sort of steady state baseline. I'm going to be a little bit nebulous about what steady state means, but let's just say it's when you're not actively coping with some sort of challenge. And then we have the stress exposure, and then we have recovering from that, and then back to steady state. And the idea with allostatic processes is that the allostatic processes, because they are changing set points, that is, mounting physiological responses to help you cope, those are relatively more active during the stress and recovery periods compared to the steady state. And those include things like neuroendocrine and autonomic responses to exposures, immune responses as well, and oxidative stress, which happens because you're mobilizing energy. And so in the process of mobilizing energy, you're breaking down molecules. And one byproduct of that breakdown are these reactive oxidative species, which they're a byproduct, and they have deleterious effects that we try to counteract. And then we have the restorative processes. So these can include a number of different things: sleep, energy storage, growth, repair, remodeling, antioxidant capacity, telomerase activity. So we'll talk about this later, but cells divide, and in order to protect the genetic material from being damaged during those cell divisions, there are these base pair structures that are on the caps of chromosomes that help protect the DNA material from being damaged during the process of cell division. Those are called telomeres. They get repaired by an enzyme complex called telomerase, which I'll talk about later. And then finally, just DNA repair. So reactive oxidative species can actually bind to DNA and damage it. And repairing DNA obviously seems like a reparative process. So this is the diagram that was actually in the original paper from 12 years ago or so. And the thing that I might kind of add, and I think is important to really keep in mind, is that people's steady states, that is like when they're not actively coping with some sort of stressor, can differ depending on their context. So if you look at these ocean waves here, this might be my steady state as a privileged upper class person living in relative comfort. But the steady state of somebody living in a refugee camp might be very different, right? So the whether it's access to running water, fears about being assaulted, food scarcity, those kinds of things are really important and are going to affect what the steady state experience of somebody is. And so one way I might amend what I wrote a while back or put together a while back is that for somebody in those circumstances, it might be that these sort of allostatic processes are much more turned on all of the time, and the restorative processes might be tuned down or at least not working as well for a good portion of the time. So I say this to say that contexts are important: socioeconomic, pollution exposure, neighborhood characteristics, other structural factors, and also the local social environment. Do you live with people with whom you feel safe? Or do you feel some level of lack of safety with the people that you're with? So I wanted to also kind of give you a sense of what other concepts I think were helpful in informing this distinction between allostatic and restorative. And I want to note that these are gross oversimplifications, and I'll talk about one example of that. But they helped kind of seed my thinking about these processes. So one is set of concepts is entropy. So all living organisms regularly struggle against disorder to restore function. That could be the state of your desk. That could be the state of waste products that have built up in various parts of your body or in your brain. We can think of all different levels where there's constantly a struggle against disorder. And we have multiple mechanisms that are trying to kind of rebuild various states and put them back in order. The metabolic processes, which I talked about already, all living organisms have processes that contribute to breaking down large molecules to release energy and then use that energy. Those are catabolic processes. And we all have processes that contribute to building large molecules from small molecules, anabolic processes. ANS biology also kind of helps us out here. It sort of maps on a little bit, although again, this is an oversimplification. The parasympathetic nervous system promotes a lot of activities involved in growth and digestion, whereas the sympathetic nervous system promotes energy release, glucose release, inhibits digestion. But as one example of this sort of gross oversimplification, one of the things that's important when you are involved in environmental challenge is you've got to get these energy stores circulated through the body. And your parasympathetic nervous system helps with that. Now, granted, it helps by down-regulating itself so you can speed heart rate. But again, this is one example of how these dichotomies can be, a little bit oversimplified. As we were prepping for this webinar, one of the things we talked about is that, your biology is your biology. We put the conceptual frameworks on it, and that can be helpful. But it is important to recognize the limits of those, putting things in buckets. And so you can see allostatic and restorative kind of map on there. So I want to give you one specific example of an oversimplification, is that the boundaries between allostatic and restorative processes become really fuzzy for something like wound healing. I went to the Ohio State University. I worked with Jan Kiekel-Glaser when they were in the kind of height of their wound healing research. And so I've read lots and lots of work on wound healing. And when you think about wound healing, you can conceptualize it as a restorative process. But the immune response to the initial wounding is an allostatic response to invasion of surrounding tissues by pathogens. Steve described this when he talked about, being concerned about bacteria penetrating your body after you've been bitten by the saber-toothed tiger or been stabbed by a spear. So this stuff in red-orange is really allostatic, and delays in that initial inflammatory phase end up kind of leading to delays in subsequent proliferative phases. So that part in yellow is really kind of gearing up the contractors and subcontractors that are going to go in, clear the crap, and repair the damage. And then the green section of this diagram is really the sort of final stages of remodeling and kind of finishing the work. So while all of this could be construed as restorative, that red part there in the initial phases is really an allostatic process. And one thing I just want to highlight and plant right now is one of the challenges to studying restorative processes is they often they happen in the hours, days, and weeks after whatever challenge you're facing, and our ability to assess those things it's a little bit more difficult, especially when you are only studying people in the lab. But even if you're not, it is also challenging. So what I want to turn to next is some kind of ideas about how psychosocial processes could impact different restorative processes. And I have to admit, well, so one thing I have to admit is that this is mostly from a stress perspective, because that's where we have the most literature. The second thing I have to admit is at the time that we were writing this paper, I was in the middle of a major renovation of our condo. And so we were watching a lot of shows on home renovation. This happened to be a favorite one in our house. These are a former couple who would flip houses in Orange County. And I wanted to put this up here just because Christina Hack, who's still got some shows going on, a couple of people on this call, well, actually one person in this seminar was there in Orange County about 5 years ago when this picture was taken. And then another colleague of a former colleague of yours, Eli Putterman, was also present for this moment. This picture was taken by her very good looking ex-husband. So anyway, I wanted to mention that. Okay, so, and here's the remodeling kind of analogies. So one possibility is slowing the rate of repair or remodeling. So the most obvious connection is with wound healing. And this is work from Walburn and Bidhara, a meta-analysis looking at the association between psychological stressors and delayed wound healing. And the main thing I want to emphasize here is that kind of the effect sizes in the direction of stress associated with impaired wound healing, they're basically all in that direction across a number of different wound types. And this could also apply to slowing the rate of DNA repair, telomere repair, or other tissues where repair and remodeling are really important, such as the bone or the vasculature. So we have slowing the rate of repair. Some of that might be due to disruptions in the process of rebuilding or energy storage or repair, and the integrity of the materials that are used. And the example I'm going to use here is energy storage is an important anabolic process. We eat food, we break it down. Some of that breakdown is to get complex carbohydrate into blood glucose, which we then we store inside cells. The storage is signaled by insulin. So insulin is released by the pancreas. This is the pancreas. These are supposed to be the insulin molecules. They bind to receptors on, say, muscle cells, fat cells, and liver cells. When that happens, just ignore these X's for a second, a bunch of molecular signaling occurs that then has the cell pull glucose from circulation and store it inside the cell. But this is a this is a figure that's showing you insulin resistance. What happens is that these molecular processes inside cells get disrupted for various reasons, leaving more blood glucose in circulation. And over time, this can progress to type 2 diabetes. So I'm going to lay on top of this another set of restorative processes that can be important, which is sleep. So it's one of the times in our lives where we're really as free as we can be of external challenges. Restorative theories of sleep suggest that biological processes in the brain and body help sustain waking behavior, including energy storage. So one of the really interesting sets of findings over the last couple of decades is that if you deprive people of sleep, even just like cutting their sleep in half, you can induce insulin resistance. You can reduce insulin sensitivity. I'm going to show you a graph that shows a bunch of bars kind of going in the downward direction. And that is indicative of insulin resistance. And so a number of studies in healthy people showing that multiple nights of depriving them, not completely, but say like half of the sleep that they normally get, you get this disruption in how insulin works. And you pretty consistently see insulin resistance. Another example comes from Alyssa Eppel's original paper on telomere length and telomerase. Again, telomerase helps rebuild telomeres. This is just supposed to be shown right here. In her work, she found that low stressed caregivers showed higher levels of telomerase activity compared to caregivers reporting higher stress. There's sort of mixed evidence between studies showing that exposure to chronic stress is related to higher telomerase activity and some showing lower. It's a dynamic process. We need more data. I highly encourage you to take a look at this review paper by Julin and Alyssa that came out recently. And then finally, another possibility is disruptions or overcompensations in what we might call normative processes. So these could include increased programmed cell death because repair isn't working. This could include things like scarring or other tissue accumulation in the healing process. So this is a scar on my arm. This is the cross-section of an artery where you might have increased tissue accumulation in part because of a plaque. Or overeating following a night of sleep loss might be a way that over time, these sort of normative processes end up becoming problematic. So I put all this up here just to give you a conceptual idea of how psychosocial factors could, in this case, have negative impacts on restorative processes. What I want to close with is just some ideas around well, what kind of questions might we want to ask if we're thinking about positive psychological functioning and emotional well-being, and how those relate to restorative processes. So one set of questions we might ask is, what predicts normative restorative function, even though you're facing a lot of adversity? So I'm going to use about a 20-year-old study in mice as an example. So this was work done by Andy Baum, the late Andy Baum, at University of Pittsburgh. And they had mice that were randomly assigned to either kind of live normally, and then for the experiment, they were placed for 2 hours in their home cage, but they weren't given any food or water. Restraint stress mice, for 2 hours, they were placed in a small tube. They weren't squeezed. They could breathe, but they couldn't move. It's common stressor used in these types of studies. And what they found is, this is an indicator of DNA damage up here on the y-axis, up to 2 hours after the exposure to the stressor. There were no differences between the groups in DNA damage. But at the same time, they did find about 15 genes that were involved in the DNA damage response that were upregulated. So these DNA damage and repair mechanisms were kicking in gear to a much higher degree in the stressed mice. And I wanted to show you this because you can imagine, so this is the mean, right? That there might be a mouse here, we'll just call it purple mouse, that's kind of over here near the mean. And there's another mouse down here that's below the mean. And the question is, these mice are both going through the same thing, the same, restraint stressor. What might predict this purple mouse looking the way it does in terms of having relatively average levels of DNA damage response versus an animal that is not showing the same response? Is it differences in life experience, social experiences? That might be one way to think about how positive psychological factors might be related to these restorative functions. Another question we can ask is whether we can enhance restorative functions. So this is a correlational study that Sarah and I did together a while back. We wounded people in the lab, and then we looked at recovery 2 hours after we wounded them. And interestingly, for people who were stressed, we could see differences between people who were high in trait positive affect and people who were low in trait positive affect. Now, let's just assume for a second that this happens to be the normal range of recovery. We actually don't know what that is. Could we, through some kind of intervention, push people into a higher range? Now, this requires a couple of things. One, you have to know what the normal range actually is for a biological measure. For some things like insulin sensitivity or sleep, we have a good sense of what that looks like. But many other restorative processes, we don't actually know what the range is. And establishing those ranges is sort of an important step before determining if enhancement is possible. I should also note there have been about 19 studies looking at psychological interventions and whether they can enhance wound healing. A lot of methodological differences, very difficult to draw firm conclusions, some evidence of publication bias. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done there. I will put in a plug for social connection as a possible target. So piggybacking on what Steve had to say. This is work from my dissertation. This is not an example of how social connection can increase restorative processes, because in my dissertation, we randomly assigned people to go through not go through the Trier social stress test. And then these groups either they did, the dark line is ones who did the stressor, and then in the gray, they went through the stressor, but right beforehand, we had a confederate in the lab who tried to provide them with support. Wasn't the best manipulation. You can see it didn't work at all. But more recently, some work from Elizabeth Broadbent's group at Auckland. What they did is they brought people into the lab. There was a control condition where participants read magazines for 15 minutes. And then the social closeness manipulation involved having participants for 15 minutes talk to another person. And they were given questions designed to facilitate closeness. So this is basically the fast friends paradigm for those of you who are familiar. So they each take turns answering questions, and the questions become increasingly more personal. What's your name? Where are you from? If you could change one thing about yourself, what would that be? And then kind of the latter questions are, if a crystal ball could tell you the truth about yourself, your life, the future, or anything else, what would you want to know? So they become increasingly personal, designed to increase closeness. And what they find is that the participants in the social closeness condition showed faster skin barrier recovery and wound healing compared to participants in the control condition with about a modest effect size. One other kind of signal about social closeness, which I will advertise, is that we've been looking at how stress is related to cellular senescence. So this is when cells divide, and kind of over time, they've gone through so many cell divisions, they're not going to divide anymore. This is related to, this is an important indicator of biological aging. What we found, and this is a sample of 73 middle-aged parents, we found that higher ratings on the perceived stress scale are related to higher indicators of P16 gene expression. P16 is a marker of cellular senescence. So this is collaborative work with Jude and also with Steve. What I'm going to do is show you the same data, but I'm going to split it out 3 ways. And the way we split it was based on participants' ratings of how close they feel to their intimate partner, and on the inclusion of other and self scale. So this is work we published a couple of years ago in Aging. At kind of middle and low levels of closeness, greater perceived stress related to greater cellular senescence, but not for the people who reported higher levels of social closeness. Now, to the degree that any of this is related to restorative processes, it's interesting, but we still need to unpack the degree to which restorative processes are involved in these sort of cellular senescence indicators. And then finally, I just want to mention that when we think about restorative processes, it opens up novel mechanisms to explore. Parasympathetic ones are related to metabolic and growth pathways. There's been a lot of focus in wound healing on this, not so much on what happens here in these later phases, these remodeling and repair mechanisms. And then a lot of the fundamental building blocks of restoring our function come from what we eat, and also are conditioned on our level of physical activity. And so when you think about restorative processes, these are probably very important mechanisms, including sleep. Okay, so I think I will end there. This is where I think there is potential to intersect with psychological well-being, psychological and emotional well-being. Is those kinds of factors could help us ask these, knowing more about that can help us ask these kind of questions. And so hopefully you've gotten a sense that there is a universe of biological functions that in some ways is still understudied, but could use more empirical attention, where the kinds of things that you're interested in could be highly relevant in promoting health. So I will end there. I'll stop my share for a second, and I will open it up for questions and discussion.
Sounds good. Thank you. Sorry, I think I disappeared a little bit.
Sure.
I'm going to be moderating, so I'm just going to take a look at the questions that are up. If I can pull that up real quick. I seem to. Sorry, I can't seem to see the questions right now. Oh, there it is. Okay. Just going to wait for questions to trickle in, but I do have some of my own.
Sure.
So I get that the wound healing is a great paradigm to study sort of restorative processes, but could you talk a little bit more about sort of maybe other paradigms that we could think about that allows us to look at different restorative processes for different systems?
Right. So I think one that there's always been historical interest in, but is challenging, is DNA repair, for example. Part of the problem is that the ways that we can study DNA repair, we sort of study the end product, which is like how much damage is there now, right? But how much damage is there now is a function of like what is going on in the repair process. And I think this is one of the broader challenges with any of these reparative processes is actually measuring repair as it is happening, and timing has a lot to do with that. And some of the kind of DNA repair assays I know have been they are just more historically challenging to do, more expensive, more logistically challenging. And so some of this is a kind of spotlight challenge. There are other ones as well, bone remodeling and repair. Also one where, it's easier to measure the end product, so to speak, rather than the process itself. Because you could imagine what you would have to do in order to actually access what's going on in the bone. You can think about repair happening, or you can think about regrowth and repair happening in endothelial lining, for instance, as well. That is potentially interesting, but again, challenging to try to study. So I think a lot of those are really, really interesting. There are methodological and timing challenges that are related to all of them.
Sounds good. I saw a question in the Q&A by Sade. Which do you think we could or should aim to affect more during stress recovery, the intensity of allostatic process or the effectiveness of restorative processes?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because what we don't necessarily know is whether, so for instance, let's say that I'm interested in kind of down regulating the stress response during a stressor, right? So let's just use, I'll think of like, there've been a number of studies where, you randomly assign people to do CBT, and then you look at whether they show larger or smaller cortisol responses to stress, right? The question that we don't know is, okay, if you can do that, if you can downregulate autonomic activity, are the benefits of that solely due to the benefit of reducing the reactivity, or are there these other sort of additional benefits to the kind of after effect or recovery processes? Again, this speaks to the broader challenge of we don't always study these things at the same time, one, and they work on different timeframes. But again, I think this is where if we can get kind of creative about how we measure these, as long as we've got measures of both, then we can think about which one is relatively more or less important, but we just don't know.
Sounds good. Yeah. Howard has a question. Let me see if I could work this out. I think Howard, you should be able to ask now.
It looks like you're muted though. So I don't know if you can unmute yourself. And if we can't.
Hey, Howard.
Yeah.
I think you have to unmute yourself because I gave permission to allow to talk. You can also type it out too, Howard, if that's easier.
Pins and needles.
Sorry, I think we're experiencing some difficulties. I'm pretty sure I clicked allow to talk and while we sort that out, I do have another question. So a lot of the interventions were focused on like singular ones. Typically, though, we think about it in terms of multiple things happening at the same time. So if you could imagine having some sort of diet or nutrition, just the wound healing, right? You could presumably there's things that you could apply to the wound that sort of increases the rate of wound healing, and then not matching that, but adding a sort of psychological intervention. Do you think that would be sort of a good model to see if psychological interventions could increase the rate of whatever that ointment is, or whatever the physical healing is.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, some intervention studies have been interested in, can they be adjuvants to existing biomedical interventions, right? So yeah, you could imagine, for instance, some of the studies that have been done in the context of wound healing are on chronic wounds. So these are wounds that they were not administered to people, but instead, emerged as a consequence of, let's say, type 2 diabetes, for example. This is where I think there are really interesting opportunities to collaborate, but they can be challenging, of course, because first you need to have a little proof of concept to know that this is going to work. And then second, then you've got to run the trial and it's got to be big enough. But I do think that there is potential room to sort of do that, which is, you could randomly assign. So, you could randomly assign people who are all going to get the same, the same wound treatment, and randomly assign them to, say, like relaxation is a common one in this literature. Randomly assign them to, some sort of relaxation intervention versus not. That would be a really great way to kind of bring some of the emotional well-being work into the, again, kind of treatment of chronic illness sphere. And where you might have a chance of, getting large enough sample sizes to really draw those kinds of conclusions. So yeah, I think that would be a really, that would be a good path for this kind of work.